The morning started like any other on my land. Cold air biting at the edges of dawn, coffee steaming in my mug, boots crunching on the gravel path I built myself. Silence, authority, my ritual before the workday. Then my eyes caught the flash of chrome across my driveway, and my pulse slowed into something colder. A brand new $70,000 SUV sprawled across my private drive like a barricade, angled to block every inch. Not a mistake, not an emergency, a deliberate blockade. Before we move forward, comment down from where you're watching right now. I want to see how far this story travels. That SUV didn't belong to a lost stranger or a random visitor. It was HOA Karen's, the self-appointed queen of our homeowners association. Mid-50s, perfectly highlighted hair, a clipboard as permanent as her scowl, and a record of weaponizing rules against anyone who didn't bow. She'd been circling me for months, firing off letters about my tractor, nitpicking my mailbox color, even trying to fine me for my American flag being too large. But this was a new level of arrogance. She had literally decided that my driveway was hers. I walked closer. Still in the measured steps I learned from years of training, the mug steady in my hand. There, under her windshield, was a note. Bold handwriting daring me to react. "You don't use this driveway enough, so I'm borrowing it today. Deal with it." The audacity burned through the morning chill. My neighbors had already noticed. Some peeked from windows, some whispered in small knots, phones half raised. HOA Karen wanted me to come knocking, to beg her to move, to feed her sense of power. But instead of rage, a strange calm settled over me. My name is Jackson Cole. I'm not just a homeowner. I'm a veteran who's spent decades on land, machines, and law. I know exactly what my rights are, and I know how to use leverage. On my property sits more than a driveway. It sits on a tractor, a big, diesel-breathing piece of iron built to move earth, trees, and anything else in its way, including a luxury SUV that doesn't belong. I took another slow sip, steam curling into the cold air. She thought blocking my access would break my routine. She didn't know she'd just triggered one. The quiet man she'd been fining, threatening, mocking was about to become the one problem she couldn't handle. The note under her windshield wasn't just arrogance, it was evidence. And the machine sitting in my barn wasn't just horsepower, it was a perfectly documented solution. What happened next would be recorded by every camera on the street. Karen thought she was running this neighborhood. She had no idea what I was about to do. People always assume a man loses his temper when pushed. They don't understand discipline. My name's Jackson Cole. I bought this acreage after 20 years of service. Boots in mud, eyes on procedure, hands on heavy equipment. I came home with two things that shaped me: a respect for law and an instinct for leverage. The first means I document before I act. The second means when I act, it lands. HOA Karen never grasped either. Since the day I closed on this property, she's tried to turn my life into a checklist of petty fines. First, it was a letter about my tractor being an eyesore. Then a warning over the size of my flag. Then citations for my lawn not meeting her aesthetic standard. Each time I answered with calm paperwork. Photos, timestamps, a copy of the CC&Rs highlighted in yellow. Each time she grew bolder. She believed my silence was surrender. Neighbors whispered about her at block parties, how she'd slapped liens on retirees for planting rose bushes without approval, how she'd forced a single mom to paint over her kid's mural, how she'd ordered a fence torn down on a technicality. They whispered but didn't confront. Karen thrived on that. But I'm not built to be managed by intimidation. I keep my land like I keep my gear. Sharp. Driveway spotless, mail organized, tractor maintained to military spec. My cameras cover every angle, Every letter she's left me lives in a digital folder. I even keep a log of her passing my property. She thought she had the upper hand because she wore a clipboard and could quote bylaws. She never noticed that I'd been quietly stacking evidence the same way I stack firewood, orderly, dry, ready to burn. When you've spent years operating heavy machinery under strict protocols, you learn patience. When you've been under live fire, you learn to keep your pulse steady. That's the difference between a tantrum and a tactic. This morning wasn't an impulse. It was the moment a months-long pattern turned into proof. Karen's SUV wasn't just blocking my driveway. It was trespassing on the one place she couldn't twist, my private property. And I wasn't about to waste time begging her to move it. By the time I set my mug down, I already knew how this would end. The question wasn't whether I'd act. It was how she'd react when she realized she'd just handed me her own rope. HOA Karen didn't rise to power by accident. She built her little empire the way small tyrants always do. Paperwork, gossip, and intimidation disguised as community standards. Mid-50s, rings glinting, nails immaculate, she treated the board like her private army and the bylaws like her personal weapons manual. Over the past 3 years, she stacked allies, promising favors to some, threatening fines to others. Her greatest trick was selective enforcement, hammering outsiders, forgiving her friends. At board meetings, she'd stand at the head of the table, voice syrupy when cameras were rolling, sharp as a blade when they weren't. She pushed through rules about parking, landscaping, even what flags could be flown. Every new restriction tightened her grip. Neighbors called her the Queen, half joking, half afraid. A retired teacher down the block paid hundreds in fines for a garden gnome. A veteran was threatened with a lien over a service dog ramp. Families lost sleep over violation notices for holiday lights. Each story was another notch in her crown. I'd been watching her moves the way an investigator watches a target. I kept copies of meeting minutes, screenshots of her emails, even a few recordings of her public rants at block parties. She thought she was untouchable because the board voted the way she told them to. But I saw cracks. 2 members grumbling in private, neighbors whispering about recall petitions, people tired of her double standards. My driveway blockade was just the latest play in a long campaign. Karen believed she could force me to bend or explode, either way proving her power. She didn't know I'd been mapping her pattern like a battle plan. She didn't know that every petty act had been logged with dates and witnesses. She didn't know that when I moved her SUV, I'd be moving the entire board's perception of her with it. This wasn't just a fight over a parking space. It was the moment her facade would crack in front of the very people she'd been ruling. She'd weaponized bylaws for years. I was about to use them as evidence. My tractor would be the show everyone remembered, but my file on her would be the knife that cut her throne out from under her. The moment I saw Karen's SUV, I didn't just feel anger. I felt the click of a system I'd already built. Months of quiet documentation turned into a single checklist. Before the tractor ever moved, my phone was in my hand. Photo of the SUV blocking the drive, close-up of the license plate, wide shot showing the property line, time-stamped on 2 separate apps. Another photo of the handwritten note under the windshield, neighbors in frame, a few nodding, evidence sealed. Inside my shop I had a folder labeled HOA Karen. Every notice she'd sent, every fine she'd tried to levy, every time-stamped photo of her creeping by my lot. Copies backed up to 2 clouds and an external drive. I even had recordings of her contradicting herself at board meetings. She loved to posture about community safety, but her emails read like a power addict. That morning I opened my laptop for one quick verification. State statute on obstruction of ingress and egress, subsection on private residential property. Trespass. I scrolled further, pulled up the HOA's own CCNRs, the covenant Karen used as her hammer. Nowhere did it grant authority to block a homeowner's driveway. I screen captured the section, annotated it. If she called the police, I'd already have the law in my favor. I also sent a text to 2 neighbors who'd been targeted before. Karen blocked my drive. Can you witness? Both replied within minutes. Here and watching. A 3rd neighbor posted in the community chat. He's documenting. She left a note. The crowd gathering outside wasn't just spectators. They were potential witnesses. Even my tractor prep was deliberate. Before rolling it out, I snapped a photo of its clean forks, showing no damage, no pre-existing dents. Chain of custody for steel. It sounds obsessive, but after 20 years of writing after-action reports, you learn to anticipate every angle. If Karen accused me of vandalism, I'd have before and after shots. If she screamed assault, I'd have video showing I never touched her. This wasn't going to be a rash outburst. It was going to be a recorded, defensible action. Karen thought she was cornering me into a tantrum. She had no idea I'd been building a case against her for months. My cameras, my files, my witnesses, all of it would frame what came next, not as revenge, but as a lawful homeowner removing a trespassing obstacle. By the time I rolled the tractor out of the barn, the sun had climbed high enough to glint off Karen's SUV like a challenge coin. Diesel thunder filled the cul-de-sac, a low growl that made curtains twitch. Neighbors stepped out now in clusters, phones up, whispering. He's not really going to do it, is he? Oh, but I was. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't make a scene. I just eased the throttle forward, tires crunching gravel, forks lowering in a slow, deliberate arc. Karen's front door flew open. She burst out in a bathrobe, hair half done, waving her arms like she was directing traffic on a runway. "Stop right there! That's a $70,000 luxury vehicle. You can't touch it!" Her voice cracked down the street like an alarm. I leaned slightly out of the cab, calm and steady. "You blocked my driveway, Karen. I'm just moving your SUV out of the way." Her face twisted. "You wouldn't dare." But the truth was, I already had. The tractor's forks slid under the SUV's frame with a satisfying groan of steel on steel. Gasps erupted from the crowd. Phones recorded every second. For a heartbeat, I held it there, the front tires of her precious ride dangling inches above the pavement. Partly for dramatic effect, partly to give her one last chance. "Move it yourself, Karen. Last warning." She doubled down. "If you drop that car, I'll have you arrested. You'll never win against me. I am this HOA." That was all I needed to hear. With a slow, steady push, I eased the joystick forward. The tractor lifted, rolled, and tipped the SUV towards the drainage ditch along my property. Mud splashed, tires sank, and the mighty SUV suddenly looked pitiful, stuck, tilted, defeated. Karen's scream could have shattered glass. She stomped her feet, shrieking threats, fines, lawsuits, police, the mayor. But I just shut off the engine, climbed down, and walked back to my coffee. The spectacle ignited the crowd. Neighbors laughed openly, some whispering snarky commentary. One shouted, "Looks like you need a tow truck, Karen." Another, "Or maybe a bigger tractor." For once, the sarcasm wasn't directed at me. Karen spun, around, red-faced, pointing at me like a villain in a soap opera. "This is your fault. You vandalized my property. I'm calling everyone." I folded my arms. "You parked on my private driveway. I just removed the problem. Simple as that." Within minutes, the rest of the board arrived in their polos and clipboards, circling her like sympathetic aides. Greg, the smug president, puffed his chest at me. "This kind of behavior is unacceptable in our community. You can't just use heavy machinery to handle disputes." I raised an eyebrow. "So blocking a homeowner's driveway is acceptable? Because that's exactly what your golden girl here did." Greg faltered. Murmurs of agreement rose from the crowd. Karen noticed the tide turning and screamed louder. Sirens cut through the air. A police cruiser rolled up, lights flashing. The atmosphere tightened. Phones steadied, recording every angle. Karen bolted to the officers, sobbing like an actress on cue. "Arrest him! He tried to kill me!" The officer frowned, glancing from her to the tractor parked peacefully by my barn. His eyes landed on me. "Sir, can you explain what happened here?" I nodded, calm as ever. "Of course, officer. Let me walk you through it." I stood there while the officer listened, pen poised. I laid it out. Karen blocked my private driveway. She left a note admitting it. I documented every angle before moving her SUV with my tractor, placing it safely but inconveniently into the ditch. I hadn't damaged it, hadn't touched her, hadn't raised my voice. I handed him the handwritten note. He raised his eyebrows, showed it to his partner, then looked back at Karen. Phones around us caught every second. Her screeching lost steam. Greg tried to salvage it. "Officer, even if that's true, surely using a tractor was excessive. We can handle this internally." The officer shook his head. "Sir, this is private property. She trespassed and obstructed ingress. Frankly, he showed restraint. Most would have just called a tow truck, but this..." He glanced at the SUV canted in the ditch. "This is creative, not criminal." The crowd erupted in laughter. Even the officer cracked a smile before regaining composure. Karen's face went crimson. "You're all against me. This whole neighborhood is ungrateful. I am the HOA." That was the breaking point. One neighbor shouted, "Not anymore, you're not." Another chimed, "Yeah, resign already, Karen." The tide had turned completely. Her authority, her smugness, her so-called power crumbled right there on the street in front of the very people she had lorded over for years. I filed my own police report immediately after, attaching every photo, every timestamp, and witness names. Within days, I sent a certified demand letter to the HOA citing trespass, obstruction, and harassment. My attorney prepared a civil claim seeking damages and an injunction against future interference. Karen's own SUV insurance claim triggered questions about why it was on private property without permission. The same bylaws she had weaponized now documented her misconduct. She'd built a paper fortress. I'd just turned it into evidence. Weeks later, the fallout became official. My attorney's civil claim moved forward with the same precision I'd used that morning. The HOA's insurer quietly settled for damages and legal fees rather than risk discovery. Karen herself had to sign a personal apology and pay out of pocket for part of my costs after the board voted to remove her as president. Her SUV had been towed out like a defeated beast, but her grip on the neighborhood was gone for good. New board elections came fast. Neighbors who'd once whispered stepped up to run. Transparent bylaws replaced secret fines. The tractor flip that everyone had filmed became a turning point, shared in community chats, then picked up by local news as an example of a homeowner standing up to an abusive HOA. For the first time in years, people felt like the street belonged to them, not to a clipboard queen. Karen tried to bluff in emails, hinting at lawsuits, but the evidence file, her note, photos, witnesses, and the police officer's on-scene statement stopped her cold. She resigned, banned from holding any HOA office for the rest of the year, her reputation punctured. The same neighbors who once kept their heads down now waved to me when I passed, some even thanking me for taking the risk. One evening I stood by my tractor, sun dropping behind the tree line, watching kids ride bikes across the cul-de-sac without fear of another citation. I hadn't just moved an SUV, I'd shifted the balance of power in our little community. That's the thing about patience, preparation, and horsepower. They don't just solve a momentary problem, they leave a mark. If you believe bullies like HOA Karen shouldn't run neighborhoods, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from. Justice on your own property starts with knowing your rights, and having the courage to act when someone crosses the line.